I would like to tell people the truth about Scotland's oil. There's so many lies being told about it. I would like to go at the beginning and explain how the whole situation has developed right through until today. Now, I was a civil servant in London when oil was discovered in the North Sea. I was not connected with it in any way with the work I was doing, but you could imagine the rumours that were going at the time. Britannia will rule the waves once more, or in Scotland. Scotland will be the richest nation in the world. I'm afraid this did not work out to be the case, because in a way I believed that the oil should stay in the North Sea where it was until the country developed its own technology to get it out. But there was a Labour government in charge at the time. Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, and the government, because of policies then, were deeply in debt. So the Labour Party said, we must get our hands on that money, and with that we'll be able to pay off our debt, of the nation's debts, and we'll be in charge, we'll be in power forevermore. That was the thought. Then there was the thoughts behind the scenes. What if the Scots find out the extent of the monies in the North Sea? They'll want a share of this, won't they? So what was planned, what they decided to do, was to hide from the Scots the amount of oil that was in the North Sea. Now, the Scots made estimates as to how much this oil would be, which were absolutely ridiculed at the time. But 30 years later, under the Macron report, when this came out and became public knowledge, they said the only thing about Scotland's estimate of the amount of oil that was in the North Sea, it was far too low. The next thing that happened with the Labour government, they had to get hold of this money quickly, as I mentioned earlier. So what did they do? They, rather than do what I suggested, that the country should in fact own the oil like Norway has, they leased it out to oil companies. And they gave them the conditions of the leases, I thought, were dreadfully poor. And all we got in return was pennies per barrel, instead of owning the oil, which surely should have happened. But despite that, the amount of oil in the North Sea meant that the amount of money that's gone into the Treasury is £300 billion, an unbelievable amount of money. Now, what's left? I'll go in a minute, I'll just have a wee look at this here. So we can actually think of 300 billion, a bonanza on top of all that we have already. How could you lose that money? It's gone. If the position at the moment is that the Chancellor has to borrow 114.8 billion, that's the exact amount he has to borrow for the current year 2014, simply to balance his books. Now, that money is never repaid. It's added to the national debt, which goes on up and up and up, and it is at the figure now is £1.43 trillion of national debt. Now, we have to pay interest on that. We can just about cope at the moment, but if interest rates were to rise, it wouldn't be another better together scare story if the term UK insolvency came right into the equation. So that's, you wonder, how did they get rid of that money, get rid of it, squander it? Well, foreign wars were one instance. And the UK actually spends 4 times more than any modern democracy in arms. It still pretends it can rule the waves. It pretends it's a world power. And when you look at the power of the Soviet Union and the power of China and the power of the United States, we are just a small island off the coast of Europe. And how we think that we can do that is just ridiculous. And that has accounted for a huge amount of our money being wasted. Then we had the policies of Lady Thatcher, who made the southeast corner of England the richest part of Europe, and big tax concessions were given to the already rich. And that money just drained away, while the north of England and Scotland saw unprecedented unemployment due to a deliberate policy. It was a very, very sad time that happened at that time. So I've mentioned what the Chancellor has to borrow and so on, but I'll mention something else. When the credit crunch broke, we, Britain, or the UK I should say, had the highest level of debt per person, per head of person, than any of the G20 nations. So, why weren't we in a similar position to Greece? There's no reason why we shouldn't be. We were the worst. The answer is that oil monies were pouring into the Treasury at a level of £60 a second at the time that the credit crunch broke, and allied to the fact that half the oil still remained in the North Sea. At 2008 prices, it was valued at £1.5 trillion that we, in a way, got off the hook. But that's not been resolved one little bit. We are a nation, as such, deeply in debt, and despite all the soundings that we're big future coming for us, we're in a very, very poor position as far as that's concerned. Other thing I would mention is what's made a big shouting match by the Better Together campaign was that in the last year, 2013, oil revenues dropped by 4.4 billion. Why? I'll explain that quite simply. Well, the oil companies are all geared up. They've got to develop new fields west of Shetland, and of course it's a wee bit more difficult to take the oil out from the North Sea, the half it remains. So they invested in new equipment and everything else, and they invested 14.4 billion, which was the biggest amount invested in the last 30 years. So the oil companies already up and go. But investing that money, they were allowed a certain amount of that against the tax they paid. So the oil revenues for that 1 year fell. Despite that, the position was if Scotland was independent, there would be, and I've got it written down here, there would be 14th wealthiest nation in the world, whereas the UK would be 18th. Now next year, you can write this down if you like, and you can check it when the OECD gives the revised figure. If oil revenues return to normal, Scotland will be back to the 8th position. If we're independent, we could be as high as 3rd, with the UK slipping back to 28th position in the world's wealth league. Now these are figures which I have myself calculated, and I reckon I am correct in what I'm saying now. So that is the situation, how important it is for Scotland to gain its independence. Interesting thing too, for the last 32 years it's officially recorded that taxpayers in Scotland pay more per head than those south of the border. That of course means that we can easily pay pensions and things far more easier than we can, than the rest of the UK can. So in many respects we are in a far better position.